So what we're going to do is to split this session, which is complying with the EUTR challenges and opportunities, into two sub-sessions. The first lot will look at certification and EUTR compliance in the furniture sector, and we'll have a presentation from Jade Saunders from Chatham House, and then responses from John and Alun from FSC and PEFC, and then we'll open up to questions and answers. And I said some of the speakers will have to go then. So then we'll come back to Nick Sammons, who's going to talk slightly more broadly about the EUTR, and hopefully we'll have time for a slightly more general discussion as well. And I will try and bring in any responses from staff from the European Commission. Now they're not in the chair and therefore can avoid answering questions. So let's get on to the first bit of it, which is looking at the furniture sector. So Jade, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone, I'm really sorry about this morning. Apologise on behalf of English infrastructure. It is disastrous. A journey that should have taken me an hour and a half took me 4.5 hours. So Duncan was slightly alarmed at how many slides I've got, so I'm going to rattle through them, but wave if you don't understand me, because I do speak quite quickly anyway. You don't need to see that. Okay, so the context. We've been working with the competent authorities for the EUTR over the last year. We had 4 workshops. 2 were sort of general readiness workshops. 1 focused on the furniture sector, 1 focused on enforcement synergies with CITES. We've had participation of 18 of the 28 member states, plus US LACI officers. 18 may not sound that great, but that's how many the Commission get for flagged meetings on this stuff, so we consider that quite good. Within the context of the furniture meeting, we were looking across the sector at compliance challenges. The idea being to start to introduce enforcement officers to some of the challenges inherent in enforcing what's quite obviously quite complex legislation in a very complex sector. So it felt like there was a really key trend, which was that all of the trade data shows the international regulated trade moving away from sort of logs and simple products towards much more complex products. But the way the legislation was drafted, the guidance was drafted, and all of the discussion about compliance tools was sort of being framed, was all thinking about supply chains for very simple products rather than these crazy supply chains for things like furniture. So the meeting was a combination of a technical discussion with the competent authorities and a few sort of expert witness types, and producer country perspectives from China, Vietnam, India, and Thailand, which are basically the big exporters to the EU of these kinds of products. So these are the products that are regulated. Not all furniture is covered. There was obviously some pretty complex lobbying going on, given that tables are in and chairs are out. Don't know quite who managed to pull that one out of the bag, but well done them. Imported furniture overview, just a few trade stats to give you sort of context. So imports peaked at 6.2 million, roundwood equivalent, 4.3 billion euro in 2007. They've dipped since then because of the economic situation, but outside of that dip, the broader trends show increasing exports into the EU. I don't know if you can see the slides, but I did ask Laura, she's printed a few copies off, so if you want to have a look at the charts, they're in there, and they're also in a background paper which has subsequently been revised and is going to be published shortly. I should note that the data was all generated by Rupert, who's not here, but I feel like I should give him a mention. Still, domestic manufacturers dominate in the EU for furniture. Poland and Slovenia are key production hotspots, but there is a trend, as I said, towards increased Asian imports. And at the again, we've had this sort of peak around 2010 of 16%, and the charts show you where, but the big orange bit in the middle, if you can't see, is China, which is obviously key, and the big blue bit at the top is other Asian countries, which includes Vietnam, Thailand. The largest importing states in the EU are the UK, Germany, and France, so they're the key competent authorities to be talking about this. But after that, you've got the Netherlands, Belgium, and then you move into some of the southern states that are less engaged with this discussion. So I would encourage any of you who have the opportunity to put pressure on Italy and Spain and Portugal to to do so, to start to engage with enforcing this piece of legislation effectively, because at the moment there's something of a gap there. So looking down into detail into the furniture sector, what are the kind of risks? This is obviously drawn from the information sources identified as relevant to risk assessment in the legislation, and also publications that have been generated by people like the European Timber Trade Federation. Supply chain complexity, one of the critical risk factors according to the trade. Pretty much all furniture products, all interior furniture products are extremely complex. Source country and species, you're looking at evidence of non-enforcement, known cases of illegal activities and known corruption. Again, if you're thinking about China and you're thinking about Vietnam and Thailand, these are obviously key risks. So the imported furniture sector in this sense, I would say, is hitting, it's quite a lot of red flags going up in terms of risk. And then you can go down into the risks associated with a particular supply chain. So these are kind of, within the context of the meeting, our assumptions were that most imported furniture from this region is likely to be pretty high risk. So then we started looking at what compliance tools were available, and basically certification is the primary compliance tool. There isn't any, the amount of furniture products covered by flagged agreements is marginal, and they don't function yet anyway. There's no licensed product of any sort, let alone complex products coming out of VPA countries. So you're really looking at voluntary business solutions. So we started looking at the two biggest that are operating. It's relatively low PEFC certification in countries manufacturing for the imported furniture sector at this point, but there are very significant deals that have just been done, so we're expecting an imminent expansion. There's relatively high coverage of FSC chain of custody certificates in China, Vietnam, and Japan. Limited coverage of FSC chain of custody certificates in some of the other countries that come up as furniture producers. And then there's this key data gap on actual volumes of fibre, of kind of product coming off of certified land within these supply chains. So we started looking at whether, from that, okay, so certification schemes are basically the only game in town. Like, how effective are they at allowing compliance with the specifics of the EUTR? The three elements of a due diligence system, as set out in the regulations, are the collection of information, the kinds of information there, the assessment of risk, outlining a risk assessment procedure, blah, 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 and the mitigation of risk. I think most people know, and we've also had other presentations today, so I don't need to read that to you, but so the paper goes through each of those one by one and talks about the way that the certification schemes can facilitate compliance, or can be a tool for operators hoping to comply with those elements. I've just cut and pasted this pretty much out of the paper because it was such a contested paper. We had a very long process of discussion that I didn't want to misrepresent what was in there with a very truncated bullet point. So the legislation, collection of information, the legislation requires a broad set of information to be collected. However, it's not clear that all of that information has to be collected at the same time. Instead, it's reasonable to assume that primary risk assessment can be undertaken on the basis of general information about the supply chain, and that information relating to compliance with the applicable forest legislation can be assessed later. The key bit is this idea of primary risk assessment being undertaken about the supply chain. So what that means is that it is my conclusion that an operator needs to understand some key elements about the supply chain that are not necessarily coming through certification schemes before they can make a decision about how to assess risk and how to mitigate that risk. The EUTR guidance suggests that broad risk assessment prepared under certification guidelines is acceptable in some cases. However, I think that my reading of the legislation is that that's acceptable in low-risk supply chains, and that when you're talking about supply chains that are not of negligible risk, basically you do need to go down to a much more detailed level of information than is automatically generated by the chain of custody for a certification scheme. However, the certification schemes have reacted to this. The FSC now have a new advice note that allows information to be passed through the supply chain about concession level and species. And the new PEFC standard also allows the collection and passing on of this information. Both of the systems are quite new. They're not, the information that's passed through them is not currently going to be audited, is my understanding of it, and they're pretty untested in practice, what the quality of the information that's being passed through and how quickly it can be, or where in the purchase process it can be made available. So can that information be made available up front before a product has been purchased to allow primary risk assessment on the part of a company? I think that the FSC online claims platform, if it's made mandatory, will have the data capacity to underpin this information flow and make it much more credible. But it's not clear that it will be made mandatory, and there's lots of industry resistance to it at the moment. Assessment of risk. The availability of certified or verified products is one factor that should be considered, but not the only one. There are lots of other there are a number of other key factors that are identified in the regulation as part of a credible risk assessment process. So my reading of that is that in themselves, schemes can't take responsibility for the assessment of risk. They can be essentially that the legal responsibility for collecting that information and assessing about a supply chain and assessing the risk inherent in that information must stay with the operator. Mitigation of risk. So in risky supply chains, just pointing you back to the earlier slides about my assumptions about the imported furniture sector, which I think most of the supply chains are inherently risky. A decision to purchase certified products can be used as evidence of risk mitigation as long as the purchase has been undertaken in line with all relevant scheme requirements and the veracity of the product claim has been established. And that's key because all of the feedback that we've been getting from the competent authorities is that many, many operators misunderstand the process by which you can credibly purchase certified products. It's kind of ridiculous to think that, but there's lots of detailed guidance coming out of the certification schemes, but it's not necessarily being absorbed by the operators, and it seems like, you know, for example, assuming that a chain of custody certificate covers is inherently a product claim and that kind of thing seems to be going on. And I think I'm going to come on to fraud risks in a minute, but it seems to me that if you don't really focus on the legal responsibility staying with the operator, then fraud risks are exacerbated substantially. Blah, 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 appropriate care and in the context of this broader primary risk assessment that I've been talking about. Just a quick scope of the fraud risks. So it seems to me that there's an obvious increased incentive for fraud through the EUTR, particularly if certification schemes are seen as a green channel rather than as one element of a broader risk assessment of a supply chain. There's the internal fraud risk. There's active fraud, potentially active fraud among certification bodies, auditors, or there's poor application of standards, which allows fraud by companies. I would say that the way that certification schemes try to control the quality of the auditors that they work with is pretty crucial there. There's external fraud, which is product labeling or basically kind of stamping of plywood with the FSC logo, which anecdotally at least seems to have been quite a problem, particularly in China. And operators taking that absolutely on face value, particularly any smaller operators who don't really, haven't got the resources to invest in understanding how to buy credible certified products. I don't know exactly where you would say that the responsibility for that lies in terms of controlling it, but I would say that it shouldn't, if a company is buying product like that, it shouldn't be seen as a mitigating factor in their in any prosecution of them. It's not like, well, we thought we were buying FSC. I think it needs to, a really clear message needs to be coming from the competent authorities that a logo is not a product claim, and they need to be looking beyond that. And then there's misrepresentation, e.g. inappropriate claims by companies with chain of custody certification. Again, I think the anecdotal evidence that these kind of things are quite a big problem at the moment, and I think the competent authorities need to be very clear in their messaging. Fraud risks 2, the investment on the part of the schemes and arguably their members, for example, the members that are resisting the online claims platform need to be thinking about that. They need to be investing in the credibility of the system if they want a tool for compliance, basically. I think the FSC have been really proactive on this. One of the things that in the toing and froing that I've had with John on the drafting of the paper, I've learned a lot about the way that the FSC are investing in controlling the quality of their supply chains for complex products. There's fiber testing, trademark licensing and control, this online claims platform, and a national integrity project in Russia, which I think arguably there's a few other obvious countries where something like that might be set up. I understand that the PEFC are waiting for evidence of fraud, and obviously they're in relatively lower risk supply chains at the moment, and they're expanding into higher risk supply chains, so perhaps that's appropriate, but I do think that maybe being a bit more proactive would be useful. And again, I think we need to come back to this primary message, which is that the ultimate responsibility for certification fraud risks lies with the operator. It's not appropriate for the certification schemes to be taking on and saying all of our products are low risk, because to me, they're not the regulated bodies under the EUTR. So it needs to come back to the operator purchasing in a way that is informed and getting really clear messages about this from the competent authorities. I think that's it. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jade. Now we're going to have two fairly short responses from the certification schemes themselves, starting with John Hontelez from FSC.
Good afternoon. I'm really privileged to finally speak at Chatham House, such a very important institution for timber issues. So I'll have a brief response, an informed response, because I was in a privileged position to have already seen the paper that Jade has finished this week, and an edited version. And I recommend everybody to read it. It's, I think, a quite fair presentation about the challenges and opportunities of certification schemes in the timber sector. I'll say a little bit about how, first of all, FSC has responded to the EUTR and how we see the EUTR in relation to FSC. So it's quite obvious that we support the EUTR. Legality is a very important step to move to sustainability. We've taken measures since the EUTR came out to increase our performance. We've been looking at what the EUTR requires and where our system is not responding to that properly. Jade already mentioned one advice note, because our system does not automatically transfer information about origin and species towards the end user. So we have adopted an advice note, and it's a nice term, advice note, but it actually is an obligation for companies that are being asked by their clients to provide this information. So on request, it's not a systematic issue. It's when a buyer, for example, in this case, an operator in Europe, asks its supplier to provide information about country of harvest or concession of harvest if necessary, and species. The supplier has to cooperate, and if the supplier doesn't have the information itself, has to go further up the supply chain. So this is a kind of ad hoc practical solution to this problem. Secondly, we have put out advice notes that clarify what actually categories of laws have to be taken into account, complying with the first principle of FSC, being legal. Then we have included in the chain of custody standard the requirement to comply with trade and customs laws. And we have terminated tolerance on minor components of unknown origin. And then still we are working on one that is quite complicated and nobody is actually talking about it, is the issue of what is waste and what is raw materials in the EUTR. And there's a slight difference between the EUTR, or let's say the waste policy of the European Commission and our system. So we are working on finalizing that closing that gap as well. Then how the EUTR looks at FSC. So as Jade already told and has been discussed here also in previous years, there is a role for certification schemes in risk assessment and risk mitigation. But first of all, these schemes have to comply with certain requirements that are clarified in the Implementing Act, which came out in 2012. And for operators, there has been some guidance on how to assess certification schemes in a guidance document that came out last year, which gives further advice on what kind of certification schemes you can actually use in risk assessment and risk mitigation. Our conclusion, looking at those, the Implementing Act and the guidance document, that we are complying with these requirements, so that FSC certification can be used as part of a due diligence system. Our message to operators always has been, and this is very much as also what Jane has been saying, FSC is not a green lane. You have to have a due diligence system. The responsibility in the end for the results of your assessment remains with the operator. FSC can be a useful tool inside the due diligence system. As far as the first step of due diligence information, our advice now can help. A risk assessment, in case of imports coming with an FSC claim, you have to assess the status of the supplier. You have to see whether it's really a certificate holder. You have to see whether its certificate includes the kind of products that you're buying from them. You have to assess then the validity of the claim that comes with the product, and in case of doubt, you have to do further research so that in the end you have a reasoned opinion why the claim can lead to a conclusion of low risk. And of course, you have to be able to give competent authority full report on your DDS. And last year, I produced an implementation guide for operators on how you can actually interpret how FSC works and what kind of tools we have, including the Global Forest Registry, when you want to do your own risk assessments. And this is an implementation guide I intend to update in the next few weeks. So about fraud, which Jade has spoke quite a bit about. So what's about fraud with FSC claims? First of all, inside the system, we have one global system for assessing, accrediting and assessing certification bodies who are, of course, our police force, you can say. So we really aim for one level of quality across the world about the certification bodies. This is done by Accreditation Service International. CBs are also expected to follow a risk approach, so they have to step up control or do more intensive audits when they think there is more risk. And when they are not doing this according to how stakeholders or how ASI expects it, ASI can also do its own controls. We have complaints procedures. Any stakeholder, that can be another company in the supply chain, it can be NGOs, it can anyone who feels that there's something wrong with a certain certificate holder can open complaints procedures, either first to the CBs, then to the ASI, but also to FSC itself. We also have rules about trademark use, and we have national offices that are following up the rules about trademark use. Our trademark is registered and protected in most of the countries. And we have also increasingly special attention for risk countries, and Jade already mentioned our integrity project in Russia. We are making changes to our controlled wood assessment, which has been traditionally done by companies that wanted to use controlled wood, but now is being moved towards the risk assessment part to FSC itself, its national offices or the FSC office. And, well, it's been mentioned already, the online claims platform. Well, it's of course still meant to become mandatory. The question is more when, and also what actually will be the functions in the end, because this is, as you probably, some of you know, quite subject of a quite intensive discussion. So we are taking all kinds of measures to have low risk in our system, but no risk we cannot guarantee. Concerning external fraud with FSC claims, yes, it's probably true, and well, let's say it's true, that non-certificate holders are using the FSC logo and the name. We are chasing them, but we have limited means. So operators, companies that are importing FSC of materials that are supposed to be FSC, they have to be vigilant themselves. They have indeed to check whether the company is in the FSC certificate base, have to check the claim itself, and ask questions when in doubt. We're also FSC International. We now have a quality assurance unit in FSC International, or national offices can help. If the operator itself is an FSC certified company or has a trademark license, he normally knows how to do this. He has been trained, he has annual contacts with certification bodies, and so he knows what a certificate is and what a claim is. But if he has no link at all, and this is quite possible, operators are importing FSC materials without being certified themselves. There's nothing against that. So they have basically no contacts with FSC, and they may also know not all the details and the rules of the game. So that is, of course, an area where, as FSC, we have no regular communication with them, and we cannot advise them. Indeed, competent authorities have an important role to play there. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And now the second response from Alun Watkins from PEFC.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Jade. Thank you for the chance to respond to the report. I guess a lot of what John says, I could just say ditto and go and sit down, I suppose, but that'd be far too easy. I think the report was fair, and there was some good points about certification in general, but I think there's also some confusing messages in there, and I would like to try and sort of put some of those right as far as the context of PEFC is concerned, and how we can help, again, assist operators meet the requirements of the EUTR. I'm sure most of you are aware of this type of simple diagram of chain of custody. Unfortunately, it's for paper rather than furniture, but the idea is pretty much the same, so a little bit of imagination, I guess. My simple diagram, I'm a fairly simple sort of chap and like to keep things very simple. I think we all start and go back to the certified forest. For some time now, PEFC and FSC have been certifying forests as being legal and sustainable, and allowing the forest owner to sell their timber as legal and coming from sustainably managed sources. Again, as John mentioned, PEFC are also recognised, if you like, as a credible scheme under the Article 4 of the implementation regulations. So you would think that would be enough for an operator. The operator's notion, I guess, or core notion of the EUTR is to minimise the risk of placing illegally harvested timber on the marketplace. So if he's buying from a credible certification scheme that's offering legal and sustainable timber, you think he's most of the way towards meeting his requirements. Not all the way, but a long way along that line. Unfortunately, I guess, in between the timber leaving the forest and arriving at the retailer or consumer, has to go through numerous steps. Each one of those steps, again, has to be independently audited by a third-party certification body, like the forest owner, and have a certificate to prove that they receive and pass on those credentials. They have duties, as like John mentioned under FSC, to ensure that the immediate person they're buying from has a legitimate and valid certificate. Not just certificate, but they also need to look at the scope of that certificate. Something that was mentioned in the report, I'm not sure Jade mentioned it in the presentation, there was some issues about companies actually being able to, being certified, but also selling uncertified product. That happens, has been happening for quite some time, and will continue to happen. Some people have very limited scopes as far as their certification is concerned. So it's important that everybody along the supply chain also assesses the scope of that particular certificate. So we go from the timber getting through to the operator, meeting most of the requirements is coming from a legal and sustainable source. He also needs some extra information. That extra information has been provided by the revision of our chain of custody standard. The 2002-2010 standard went through a long process of revision and review to make sure that it fully aligned with the EU timber regulations and other frameworks. The chain of custody standard is a global standard, so it has to make sure that we are, again, relevant to the Australian system or whatever. I haven't got time to go through all the details. I'm probably glad about that on a Friday afternoon of the chain of custody standard, but just to mention one or two of the important issues. There is now an integrated due diligence system in the main body of the standard, and this applies to all certificate holders. It used to be in the appendix, and it only used to be there for mixing uncertified with certified material. It now applies to all certificate holders. And certified material is not exempt from that due diligence system. The system itself could be used as a standalone system for somebody operating a due diligence system. And for that, we've introduced new indicators that give an eligible risk and new indicators that give examples of high risk on both origin level and supply chain level. An important addition to the new standard was also a clause about substantiated comments or complaints or whatever you want to call them. And this could be on the species that's been used, it could be on the company that's supplying, it could be on the country of origin. If there are substantiated comments about a particular product or country, and those have been substantiated, that material that you brought through into your company automatically becomes high risk, and a full assessment and due diligence has to be carried out on that particular project. So where there's potential for fraud, hopefully this is a bit of a safety net, if you like, that allows for where complaints have been received to do a full assessment. And I have spent a little bit of time in the furniture industry, in the furniture trade. I think it's important to clarify that at the moment, as far as I'm aware, I've come across any issues with certified furniture coming from Asia having any problems with those certificates. As far as fraud is concerned, as I said again, it's not really a big issue for PEFC at this moment in time. That could be that we're not operating in some of these high-risk countries at this moment in time, but we'll see where we go. So, certified material, not exempt from the due diligence system. Extra information has to be gathered. That information is on species and origin. The operator would also need to look at the country of origin. If it is a high-risk country, he may want information then on not just the origin of country, but the subnational region or concession. And this information has to be passed down the entire supply chain. It's not just for the operator, it's the entire supply chain. Everybody who has chain of custody certificate now have to have access to that information. So certified material is exempt from actually doing the risk assessments because its negligible risk comes from a legal and sustainable source, but does need that additional information unless there are some substantiated concerns, as we say. And the last point, really, to mention is that in the report, there's a lot of information there about what happens when you're mixing materials. And it is quite common for both schemes to mix certified materials with uncertified materials into a single product. And the furniture industry is probably a big component of this because of the different mixes that goes into quite a complex trade. What we say is that any uncertified material going to be mixed with a certified product has to undergo the full due diligence. It has to meet the definition of our non-controversial sources. So as far as legality, as far as conversion is concerned, as far as GMO is concerned, as far as other issues like taxes and customs, all that comes under a definition of a non-controversial source. And the due diligence would ensure that everything that's going into that mix is above board. And these assessments are audited by the third-party independent certification body. So no timber from legal sources should be placed on the market through a PEFC chain of custody system. Okay, I think that's about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, right, we're going to open the floor to questions and comments. Jade, you have to go about 2:30?
Yeah.
So we're going to take questions and comments up until about 2:30, and then bring out Nick to give the final presentation, and then carry on our discussion about the EUTR. So if anyone has any questions specifically about furniture, I'd like to start with the furniture sector. I'd like to start with those so we make sure we deal with them before Jade has to go. Good. So there's one, at least. Christian. Oh, Karen, I didn't think it was going to work.
Okay.
Lots of broad questions were raised, so just go.
Okay, this is a pretty specific question to Alun about the due diligence requirements in the new chain of custody standard. In your you have a table in the section 5 where you have low risk indicators, which is stated to overrule any high risk indicators. And it's also, and in that table it's stated that a low risk indicator is material originated from sources that are verified by government or non-government verification programs other than third-party certifications like PEFC or FSC, that is focused on avoiding the controversial sources issues. Could you expand on what that means, how that is controlled, how that is evaluated, or how we, how do we interpret that low risk indicator? I mean, yeah. So, I mean, how is that in practice? How do we interpret that indicator in practice? Because, yeah.
Okay, thanks. If people would like to switch their mobiles off so they make annoying noises. Let's take 2 or 3 more questions and get responses. We'll go to Emily at the back.
Thank you all. I have a comment which is going to turn into a question, I hope, quite soon.
So do we.
Yeah, I know. Thanks to everyone, because I think that was really interesting. I think it was really useful to have this conversation. One of the key points that I took from Jade's presentation is that importance of looking and operators looking back and understanding the veracity of the claims being made by a certification scheme that they're seeking to rely on. So actually doing that questioning. But so i.e. don't take certification at face value, but rather question what's actually within it. One of the points that Alun made, which was, I had to write it down, certified timber is exempt from risk assessment unless there are substantiated concerns. I'd flip that one. And I'd say there's an obligation for an operator to look and see whether certification is something that it can be relying on and the extent to which it can be relying on it. And I think this communication is really important. And I think both the message coming from the competent authorities and also the message coming from the certifying organizations is incredibly important to making sure that we've got a common understanding amongst certified organizations and buyers and sellers and everyone like that. And I'll point to one other. I grabbed this off the FSC website, and it says, timber and timber products holding FSC certification provide sufficient certainty of negligible risk, therefore requiring no further risk mitigation. And I think some of the key points that Jade was getting at in terms of asking those next questions, to me, isn't reflected in that comment on the website. So I'd put the question to Jade, if I've understood her right, and I'd put the question to the other 2 panelists if they see a gap between those 2 positions.
Okay, thanks very much. Sam, over there.
Hi, thanks. Sam Lawson, Earthsite Investigations. I guess this is a question to both John and Alun, but my knowledge is more limited to FSC, but I'm guessing PEFC has similar systems, which is that what is your current strategy with transparency of data and information regarding your own audits? So when ASI does investigations into companies that are handling FSC wood or that have FSC chain of custody, they generally do not publish the results. About 6 years ago, I was in China and I spoke to someone from ASI. They had recently done an investigation of a sample of Chinese chain of custody certificate holders, which had exposed a rampant level of fraud in the system. It was a small sample, but if you applied that sample to the rest of the Chinese COC holders, it suggested a huge problem. That information never entered the public domain, and it strikes me that any person who's importing timber into furniture or timber into Europe, if they're going to be able to do due diligence and assess to what extent they can rely on FSC as providing that due diligence, they need to have access to greater information about the level of fraud in the system. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's get some responses now, and then we'll have time for one more round before Jade has to go. Jade, do you want to start?
I think there's only one question to me, which was, have you understood me correctly? And the answer is, I think, yes.
Okay.
Over to you.
Do you want to remind people what you're saying yes to?
Yes, that you basically need to be interrogating supply chains, whether you need to understand your supply chain regardless of whether or not you're deciding to buy certified wood. And if you are using that as a risk mitigation strategy, you still need to understand the supply chain and understand the process by which one buys credibly certified wood. So yes.
That's great. Thanks very much. Okay, Alan.
Yeah, I think on that same question, I think what we're doing is providing the tools to help the operators mitigate the risks. And the fact that you're buying a certified product, I think we have to be fairly sure that's from a legal and a sustainable source. If not, I think both schemes, that's what we've been growing on for the last, for ourselves, 14 years, John, for longer. And if we can't guarantee that legal timber now arrives on the doorstep, then I think we have a problem.
Guarantee.
Can I make a quick? Sorry, I got the mic. It's unfair, but I've got it. I think.
Go ahead.
Thanks. I think there's a really important distinction here which we have to be clear on, and that's the distinction between legal, according to the systems of what we're looking at through FSE, and also when we're talking about it in terms of EUTR compliance, what it is those systems are looking for. They don't have, the difference there is PEFC can regard something as legal, and that's great. But if you remember from David's presentation this morning, he was really focusing on that point that it takes the obligation back on the operator to be scrutinizing it. And it's that operator focus and that scrutiny back on the operator that makes it important that the companies relying on those certification schemes are understanding what the claims are that they're buying and are doing a bit of attention into what those really are and digging into them.
Okay, thanks.
Well, just to respond, well, this guarantee, I mean, if you're offering a guarantee, is that something that you think in the event that a prohibition case is brought on wood that comes through a PEFC certified supply chain, how would that guarantee operate in a legal situation? Would you be standing up in court?
No, I don't think we would. I think the important thing is that we're giving good tools to allow certified tip material to end up in the right places. There are always going to be non-conformances. Certification bodies are out there doing assessments all the time. They're all controlled by the accreditation body of the country they're working in. They're controlled again by the International Accreditation Forum. They're assessed on an ongoing basis. I'm not quite sure what much more we can do. I mean, it's the tools are there to be used. I don't get a call every time somebody gets a non-conformance from a certification body. So I wouldn't expect us to end up in court if somebody is prosecuted under the EUTR. The tool's are there. If it works properly, if it works effectively, there's no reason why that material shouldn't arrive at that gate or that port as legal. Okay, that's what the system's all about.
John, would you like to come in?
Yes, well, Emily, I don't know exactly which document you've been quoting. There are quite a few documents on the FSC website. Okay, well, I can't do that now instantly, but
Won't be long.
I mean, on the one hand, of course, we do make a point that we do have trust in our own system, but on the other hand, I do think that we are trying to be very careful in how we explain how you can get to the conclusion that an FSC certified product with a valid claim is low risk, and most recently we've done that in relationship to how NEPCON is assessing FSC in their due diligence guidance. It is, you can come to that conclusion of an FSC product being low risk, provided you have done quite a few steps. And in the end, it is what we also emphasize. In the end, it's the responsibility of our operator to do so. But we are handing to the operator, of course, certain advice and certain tools how you can come to that conclusion. Concerning transparency, well, I do not know exactly what ASI is publishing or not. When it comes to regular audits by certification bodies for certificate holders, I believe you can find those reports in the certification database. Also, when you're looking at how ASI was functioning 6 years ago or now, I think there's a world of a difference. FSC has been growing enormously in the last 6 years. Maybe everything is probably 3 times as big, the number of certificates in the forest management, in the chain of custody. So also our challenges have grown, but also our means have grown, and we also, as FSC, we're having quite intensive discussions with ASI on how to perform, and this integrity project in Russia is an example of that. So I think, I don't know exactly what ASI is entitled to publish about their special audits. I have to check that. But I think the regular results of regular audits are available as far as I know.
Okay,
just as far as PEFC is concerned, on that note, as far as I'm aware, the certification bodies who undertake in sustainable forest management, they have to put the final report of that particular forest area on the website, so it is publicly available.
Yeah, I think it's a chain of custody.
The next level of oversight. Talking about the ASIs as well, the people whose job it is to make sure certified are doing their job right. They're the people who do systematic analysis to try and uncover fraud. The individual case studies where it's not what I'm talking about.
Okay, let's come back to all this. Did you deal with Christian?
Yeah, just one more for Christian. Yes, under table 5 of the, under section 5 of the table 2 and 3, there's, table 1, is it, that makes the low risk? Yes, there are certain schemes that will be classed as negligible risk, including PEFC control sources, other schemes such as FSC, and you're right, along with things like VLO and VCO schemes, as long as they have the correct documentation, which you'd expect to see from a normal due diligence system. So those documentations still have to be in place.
Okay, let's have one more round of questions. So one right at the back, and then Catherine, and then two more over here.
Hi, Jago Wadley from EIA. It's interesting to see that John was willing to concede he can't guarantee no risk, but PEFC can, apparently. Maybe you should have that one out yourselves. I keep coming back to this because it keeps coming back to me. Everyone talks about high and low risk countries and whether or not you should apply or acquire information about the origin of the timber being procured under a due diligence system. Now, the timber regulation does not mention high or low risk countries. And in fact, the obligation to acquire information about the concession of harvest isn't related to the country as an overall risk rating. You have to decide whether or not there is a variance in risk within concessions within that country. Can you name me one country in which the EUTR does not require operators to establish the concession of harvest?
Okay, thank you. Question down here on the aisle. Catherine, just put your hand up.
Hi, Catherine Pasturka from British Retail Consortium. I think what I would like to see from both of the certifications is this use of the word negligible risk. And that is frequently touted around as being linked to a certification. And I think it's very confusing for retailers, brands, anybody importing. And the website, I'm not sure what page it was, but that's something that retailers come across. So the link between FSC and negligible. And I would also include NGOs and some other organizations here who are doing the same thing, saying that if it's FSC, it's negligible risk. And that is factually incorrect. So I would just like to say, to minimize the confusion of the general chat, which is what I get back, is that there needs to be a little more ownership and accountability on behalf of the certifications to make sure that they are not being misrepresented. Because then I think that would go to add to the credibility of your own certification in the end.
Okay, thanks very much. Two questions over there. Andy?
Thank you. My name's Andy Roby, based in Jakarta. My colleagues in the Ministry of Forestry have somehow got the impression that FSC and PEFC are in competition with the SVL Cup. And I just wondered if you or anybody else in the room might have some ideas as to what might be done about that, because really you're a complementary measure. So it's an unfortunate misinterpretation. Or is it based on some of the claims that you've been making?
In competition with the SVLK.
SVLK. Beatrix, over in the middle.
Sorry, I just knocked out my colleague. Beatrix Richards from WWF. I just had a quick question for Alun Watkins on the substantiated comments or complaints. I didn't know if that was in the context of the EUTR or whether that was in the context of PEFC. And if it's in the context of PEFC, could you clarify what that means?
Okay, and then there was one hand there. Was it Janet? Was it somebody behind me? No? Yes.
Janet Pritchard, legal consultant. I just wanted to maybe underscore or highlight a bit more the dialogue that was briefly happening between Alun and Jade about will you guarantee it or would you stand by that in court? Because it's very important to the question of the integrity of the regulation, because the regulation is not just about providing guidance or encouraging best efforts. It's a regulation that places liability on the operator to know its supply chain and to form judgments to assess and mitigate the risk of illegality. And if the certification schemes present themselves as providing a guarantee even of negligible risk, right, which is the standard the operators need to reach, if that same liability that attaches to the operator doesn't also attach to the certification schemes, then what you essentially are creating a kind of liability loophole in the regulation. Because at the end of the day, what gives it some power and force is that these operators are liable for the judgments that they make. So it's not just about encouraging good efforts. There's a liability question here. And I think that misplacing the role of, I think it's generally agreed that a quality and valid certification can be a useful piece of information, one tool in a risk assessment mitigation factor. But if it's taken as more than that, the liability has to attach to the person that is ultimately making the judgment and being relied on.
Okay, thanks very much. Some responses. John, would you like to start?
Yes. The first question I cannot answer. I cannot answer on behalf of the Commission or the competent authorities for which countries you do not have to do concession of harvest. We have as FSC, we have a global forest registry which gives some indications about which countries we consider as high risk or low risk, and in those countries, in many of these countries, we go down to regions. We are making now our national risk assessments for controlled wood. So we are giving our indications of where we think there are higher or lower risk, but how the EUTR responds to that, I cannot answer you. About the difference between negligible risk and low risk, apart from that low risk is easier to pronounce, we as FSC, we stick with our concept of low risk. This is how we are working, and I still have to hear the first explanation about what is the difference between negligible risk and low risk. And I think only the future will tell when competent authorities are really going to explain that to operators. We stick with our own concept, and that is how it's laid down in our standards and everything. The competition between SLVK and FSC, well, I don't think there is competition because FSC is not recognized by either the European Commission or by the Indonesian authorities as compliant with the VPA. So there is no competition, unfortunately, because I guess it would be quite good for FSC certificate holders in Indonesia that it would be. The bigger picture, of course, is that, as I mentioned in my very first sentence, for FSC, legality is tremendously important. So is SLVK is becoming a success in Indonesia, I think that gives also better perspectives for sustainable forest management. About liability, well, as I mentioned, we are making big efforts to make always the understanding that the operator in the end is responsible. They have to make up their own mind how much they can trust on FSC. And they have to have that conversation in the end with competent authorities. And I think only time will tell how convincing that story is, and whether there are differences depending on where the timber comes from or in which country you're talking. We will follow that, of course, but we are trying to make it clear that FSC is a tool, and the operator in the end is responsible for how to use that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, on that final point, I think I can, again, agree with John in that certification is a tool, like we've said all along. How the operator uses that tool is up to them, but we can only ensure that we're doing our bit throughout the whole chain as far as certification is concerned. Again, as far as the SVLK is concerned, I don't think there's any competition there. We haven't a huge presence in Indonesia at the moment, although I am aware that the Indonesians have put a scheme in for endorsement with PEFC, but that process could take 18 months, 2 years, so that's a fair way away. I think there was a specific comment about substantiated comments. That's actually, say, now a clause within the PEFC standard. And it's there for a reason, in that if there is some validated reports about certain products or certain countries, then things will become, as I mentioned in the presentation, high risk. Not quite sure how much more I can say about that, to be honest with you, but it's there for a reason. I guess chain of custody holders will need to keep abreast of reports, whether it be from trade associations or in trade journals, and validate those reports to ensure if they are correct, they need to do some extra work as far as due diligence is concerned.
Okay, thank you very much. Jade, any comments?
I don't think so.
No? Okay.
The only one general question was Jago's about the variable risk, and I would agree that there isn't a country that doesn't have variable risk.
Yes, there is. Canada.
Okay. Are you sure?
Possibly others.
I don't know. Art, would you agree with that?
Okay, let's come back to that. Right, thank you very much. So that concludes the first bit of this session. We're going to carry on the subject of EUTR, but will you say please thank you to these three speakers. And now I'd like to invite Nick to come up and give the next presentation. Nick Sammons from Carnstone Partners. And then we'll carry on, as I said, with a general discussion on EUTR questions. And if anyone wants to put questions to the European Commission, Bernard's not in the chair anymore, so therefore he can't escape answering, and his colleague Luca as well. So we'll come back to that. Okay, now if you'd like to all settle down. Art. Shh. Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Duncan. Shh. Hello, everybody. Thanks for sticking around for the last session. My name's Nick from a management consultancy called Carnstone. We are a specialist consultancy looking at corporate responsibility and sustainability work. We do a lot of work with clients down their supply chain. So we do a lot of work in raw material sourcing, risks down those supply chains, both environmental and social. We've done a lot of work with our clients looking at timber and paper in their supply chains. And since the EUTR came into force last year, we've noticed different reactions from different sectors. So we thought it would be interesting to get a sort of an overall view. So having spent a bit of time on the detail of certification, I'm sort of going to take us back up to a bit more of an overview. So like Duncan said, a few more general questions. But this is the result. The results here that I'm going to show you are the outcomes of a survey that we did in December last year, looking at reactions to the EU timber regulation. How are people responding? What's the temperature like out in the market? What kind of quality of information are people getting? Things like that. You probably can't see any of that, apart from the numbers at the top. We had a great response from everybody. We sent it out through various channels. We had 80 respondents in total. Vast majority of those were manufacturers. Those are paper manufacturers, furniture manufacturers, timber suppliers, and so on. 80% of whom, 80% of that 80, considered themselves to have the responsibility, those in Europe, of operators. Looking at the map, you probably can't see too well here, but maybe better on the side screens, is the breakdown of where our responses came from. Everything in blue is a manufacturer, everything in orange is a retailer, and the size of the pie indicates how many responses there were. So you can see very quickly that the majority came from Europe, and the majority of retailers were also based in Europe. But there was a good spread of manufacturers elsewhere as well. It's worth saying just at the outset, really, that a lot of the results that we had in probably wouldn't be a surprise to many of you. Things like composite materials we've heard earlier, items like furniture, MDF, paper. Complex materials are difficult to gather information for. People are struggling to get all the information for these. It's taking time, and they're getting a mixture of information from suppliers. So that's probably not a big surprise. But there were some interesting things that came out of it as well. Retailers particularly have experienced widespread change. And if you look at it in the context of what we were just talking about in terms of certification, the clear messaging, which is so important, retailers being affected by these complex supply chains and being so far from the forest sources themselves, so it being that much more difficult to get hold of the forest source information, the tree species, the associated documentation, and so on. Ownership of due diligence is another interesting point that came out. We're finding that from the people that responded anyway, most people are dealing with this in-house. They're tackling it in-house, they're recruiting people, they're increasing their own capacity to deal with their own due diligence systems. As we've said, it makes sense that they would do that because they are ultimately responsible. But we'll have a look at the numbers in a sec on that. There were some common information gaps as well. I've mentioned documentation already. The majority of those responding to the regulation really struggle to get hold of these documents indicating compliance. Arguably, the words in the regulation are quite broad, so actually asking the question of your suppliers on exactly what documents you need is a difficult one, but we'll take a look at that in a bit more detail also. Blanket due diligence is the norm. So we've talked about the oddities of the scope of the EUTR, the lobbying, the interesting lobbying, which has led to tables being in and chairs being out, things like that. The approach that most people are taking is a blanket approach. So they're saying that because of this complex scope, rather than applying due diligence to those that are in scope and not to those that are out of scope, we're going to take all of our timber products and timber and apply due diligence to them. So 78% of those responded are conducting due diligence on all of their product lines. I suppose a benefit of that is said there that this blanket coverage would be resilient to any review of the scope next year. So perhaps people were looking forward to that date, or perhaps they were wanting to just be confident at the time that they weren't missing anything. So collecting this large amount of data, gathering it from suppliers is a long process. It has extended procurement times. It means there's a lot more back and forth with suppliers. But it's reassuring to see that out of those companies that responded, over 60% say they've got data for most of their products. So it's good to see that they've taken control of this, they're getting the data, and a lot of the data, as they've said to us, is the correct data. So looking into a bit more detail about verifying these documents indicating compliance is another challenge. 40% of the companies that responded are having difficulty with these documents. So they're challenging to collect, it's difficult to know what to specify and what to ask for from suppliers. For those at the end of a supply chain, particularly retailers in Europe, it's difficult to get back to the original forest source, particularly for complex products like paper and MDF or furniture, as we've heard. Over a third of people there finding it difficult to get the information, all the associated information, and particularly documentation for composite materials. So what implications is all this having? I mentioned already that a lot of the blanket due diligence cover is probably inflating the amount of work that's going on, but making it more resilient to any changes in the future. Product lines are being affected by this due diligence assessment. Product lines have been removed from sale. Manufacturers are moving to suppliers that can provide the information. So there are shifts happening. I mentioned earlier that due diligence has been taken control of in-house. So a quarter of those that responded have actually hired dedicated staff to support with the due diligence process. New departments have been appointed the responsibility of dealing with due diligence. And interestingly, only 12% are using the services of monitoring organisations. So they are taking on the whole brunt of due diligence. Overall, across the board, retailers and manufacturers, procurement time, buying time has risen, staff time has risen in the to and fro with suppliers, and you could argue that material costs have risen. There's been an increased tendency to move towards the tools, as we've heard earlier, of certification. Going down a certified route might make the species and the country of harvest information more readily available. So we're finding that a lot of the respondents have actually gone down that route. And then looking at the future, we asked everybody how things could improve. How could they improve the system? How could their suppliers improve the system? It's really interesting to see that some of the other comments that came out from earlier today, there is an appetite for better communication, as you might expect, down the supply chain, both up and down the supply chain. Customers want to have more proactive information provided by their suppliers, so they want suppliers to have the information ready for them when they're there placing an order. And likewise, the suppliers want clear and consistent messaging from their customers. So the point was made earlier about exactly what information needs to be supplied to carry out due diligence. It's a relatively short list of basic information. There is that grey area around documentation, but clear messaging, consistent messaging from customers is what the suppliers really wanted. And hopefully over time that means that they'll build up an ability to differentiate themselves from competitors. There was a mention about opportunities of the EUTR earlier. There's an incredible commercial opportunity for suppliers to be incredibly proactive on this, supply the information that their customers need very quickly, so customers stay with them and don't move elsewhere. Overall, it's been a pretty promising 8 months. It's shown that companies have taken control of their due diligence process, but there are still lots of challenges. Those documents are pretty key in there, and the specific challenges around those identifying and trying to understand the supply chains of complex materials, paper, MDF, and the furniture and so on. So there's a big drive to improve the communication and improve efficiencies down the supply chain with the ultimate aim of reducing the costs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Good. Well, we've got plenty of time left for questions to Nick or any other comments or questions anybody wants to raise to anybody in the room about any aspect of the EU timber regulation. So let's start over here. All set. Questions up at the top.
Hi, John Park, Canada Wood. When you were asking the companies how well they were getting on with it, did you ask them, or were you able to find out how many of them were going way beyond what's actually required? And the ones that I've come across are the ones that are going to the ridiculous extent of saying we want details of harvesting plans, concessions of harvest, etc., shipped prior or provided to us prior to each shipment. And when you're looking at countries of negligible risk, asking for that information is not only not required, but prior to each shipment seems strangely bizarre.
Okay, thank you. There's a question right at the back.
Charles Thwaites, FSC. Nick, it's fascinating stuff, and you started talking about resource implications. Did your study actually get any implication that when you were talking about product lines changing and so on, whether people are changing actually to non-timber material, using petrochemicals and things like that? Just reassure me that we're not in a major throat-cutting exercise here, please.
Okay, thanks very much. And another question down here at the front. Sorry to go back and forth.
Julia Young from WWF. Nick, I was just wondering on that 40% figure you showed of people having difficulty understanding or getting documents, getting information. I'm just wondering if there was like more difficulty for manufacturers or retailers, you know, in that 40, was it harder for retailers? Just can you comment on that if possible?
Thank you. Okay, Nick.
Yeah, sure. On the first question on negligible risk, we did ask everybody whether they were carrying out the same checks on those sources that they identified as negligible risk. So were they requiring mitigation for those sources that they'd identified as negligible risk? Roughly a third were. So in terms of your other sort of part of that question on whether they were asking for it before, at the point of order, before it was shipped, I think that's standard practice. It has to be done beforehand. So
Right, each shipment, not once a year. Supposedly once a year, unless the risk element changes.
right, unless the product type changes, or unless the risk element changes, yes. So in terms of negligible risk, roughly a third were asking for the full amount of information and carrying out the full risk assessment on those negligible risks. The rest weren't. Charles, on moving to alternative materials, no. People are moving suppliers. Some product lines, like I said, had been pulled, but moving to alternative materials or non-timber materials didn't come out in that. And as far as the materials or the products that were pulled from sale, they were in the minority. So it's a minority of respondents that actually had removed products from sale. So I don't think that's happening based on what we've seen. And Julia, absolutely. Those towards the end of the supply chain, retailers particularly, are struggling more with items of information like documentation, much more so than manufacturers. You look at perhaps paper manufacturers, they've got a much better grasp of what's going into their machinery, as opposed to the retailers who are much more removed from that. So yeah, it was slightly above 50% of retailers struggling with documents. And tree species as well. The specific tree species across the board, about 25% of respondents were struggling to identify tree species, and again, slightly more retailers on the retailer side.
Great. Thanks very much. Okay, another round of questions and comments. Yeah, Rainer at the back.
Thank you. Rainer Technology Witness. Nick, question. Did you ask for the source of information, so where they're getting the information from? I know it's a big task to collect all the information, but as we have seen from the presentation by Daniel from Greenpeace, for instance, you have information from official sources, from government sources, which are fake documents, or there is information in the public domain by independent observers or by civil society informing about illegalities. And one aspect we didn't mention before, one element of illegality is, for instance, social agreement contracts. They very often are neglected. So FSC, for instance, had complaints about some companies where social agreements weren't respected by companies, and the complaints were brushed aside, despite the fact if you want to illegal. So question, do those companies or the respondents as well look into other sources than just documentary sources? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. There's another question, I think. Yeah?
Hi, mine is actually more of an appeal than a question. It's about illicitly traded timber. If anyone thinks they could provide me with some information or direct me to some very, very up-to-date resources on the socio-economic impacts of illicitly traded timber, or how you might assess the size and scope of illicit trade in this area, I would be extremely grateful.
Okay, do you want to tell people who you are?
My name's Olivia. I'll be upstairs.
Okay, thanks. Any questions or comments? Yes, Danielle.
Danielle van Ooyen from Greenpeace. Maybe just a comment, but the picture you paint is very positive, actually. You're very active companies, doing a lot to conduct their due diligence and do all that is required. When I talk to companies, maybe I talk to the bad guys, I don't know, but this is not the impression that I get when I talk to retailers. They don't do more than is required. They don't do blanket due diligence. They leave out everything they can, if possible. If I talk to timber traders, they are struggling, to conduct due diligence, for example, for Congo Basin timber. And so I don't have this very positive idea about how companies are doing due diligence. Can you say something about how your research, how is it, how representative it is, or a bit more on that would help me.
Great. And Jake, at the back.
Hi, Jago Wadley from EIA again. Can you give us an idea of what proportion of the 40% that couldn't get the data required still placed the product anyway?
No.
Nick, over to you.
Ryan, to your question, the source of information. In many cases, it wasn't directly asked. We didn't directly ask people where they were getting this information or struggling to get this information from. But we did find that a lot of the people, or a lot of the companies were, like I said, were moving towards certification as a tool. So it doesn't directly answer your question because we didn't gather the data, unfortunately, as far as the source of that information. So I'm sorry, I haven't got an answer for you on that. Looking at the positive picture, it is quite a positive picture, I suppose, that we've painted. I suppose the people that responded to the survey, you might say it's quite a self-selecting survey. It's those that wanted to find out more. I mean, the intention of the survey was to explore the wider industry. So explore what was going on out there, how people felt about it, what were the common areas where they were struggling, where were people doing particularly well, where was work needed. I think it was interesting to tie up some of the smallholder work that's going on as well, because it really does chime with that improved communication up and down the supply chain. If there are collective bodies that can be approached for this information, then it makes it much easier for that to flow up and down the supply chain. But I think it was quite self-selective. It's quite a small sample. I mean, 80 companies is quite a small sample. It's probably most representative of the UK retail market than anything else. But because of if you think about that map at the beginning, the majority of respondents were based in the UK or Europe. But certainly it's something we'd like to repeat. It'd be interesting to see how things change over time, increase the sample size, and we might see that positive turning into a bit of a negative, unfortunately, but we'll just have to wait and see.
How did you select the people you sent the questionnaires to?
We sent it out as far and wide as we could, really. We sent it to Timber Trade Federation, BRC, various publishers, various manufacturers as well, directly. So it was sort of clients, absolutely everybody that we could think of. Yeah.
Okay, carry on. What was that?
I think that was it. I think, Jago, you had a question on, I can't remember what it was now. What was it?
How many people had put the products on the market even if they didn't have the information?
Yeah, I don't know. Sorry. We didn't ask that question, but we can include it next time.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, last chance, one more round of questions and comments. Yeah, I've got three over there, I think. So Janet first.
Janet Pritchard, legal consultant. Just a quick follow-up on who you sent the survey to. There was a sample of 80. What was the response rate from your solicitation? So 80 is what percentage of how many you sent out?
Okay, and one right in front of you. Yeah. No. Yes, you wanted. Okay, over there.
Backwood Row Soil Association. I was actually quite surprised that as many as 12% are using a monitoring organisation, given that it's a very slow rate of approval and slow uptake of those there are so far. Any comment on that?
Okay. Anybody else? No. All right, Nick.
On the response rate, we sent it out to roughly 250. Who asked the question? Roughly 250 companies. So, what that percentage is?
It's about a third.
A third, roughly. Yeah. On the MOs, I suppose. I mean, this has come out earlier in the day. I think there are a limited number of monitoring organisations offering the service anyway. But I think I'm assuming that if companies wanted to have the service, they would have gone to those providers. So I think the fact that the risk and the liability, as has already been said today, remains with the operator. I think what we're sort of extrapolating from this is that people feel more comfortable owning it in-house and trying to build on those relationships that they've already got with their suppliers, perhaps through production, perhaps through procurement, who are actually, amongst some groups of the respondents, they are owning the due diligence process. So it is falling to production and procurement because they have those existing relationships. So that's probably why. It is. I take your word for it that it seems quite high, but I think it seems quite low, actually, amongst everybody. Hope that answers your question.
Okay. Great. I think that concludes this session then. And no doubt we'll come back to the EU timber regulation at the next meeting. So before we close the meeting, I'd just like to invite Alison to have the last word.
So just a few comments to make before we start. As I mentioned earlier, all the presentations from the speakers will be going online on the Illegal Logging website. And we hope to get those up in the next couple of weeks. And we are also producing a summary of all the discussions that we've had over the last 2 days as well. So that will also go on the website. Our next meeting, we have dates for it, so that will be taking place on the 16th and 17th of June. We will be, it's a little earlier than usual, so we will start the planning for that meeting quite soon. So I would welcome, firstly, your feedback on this meeting, and also suggestions and ideas of speakers and topics that you would like to see featured in the summer meeting. So please do let us know about that. Finally, just would like to say a few words of thanks. So firstly, I would like to thank DFID, who fund these meetings and make it possible to bring you all together. So thank you very much. A particular thank you to the team of people here who've helped to pull this meeting together and make sure that it all runs so smoothly. So we currently have 2 interns who have been working with us. Rachel Sharp has been helping with a lot of the logistics, and Adelaide Glover, who has been working very hard writing notes for the last 2 days, and will be pulling together the report, so thank you. Thank you also to Laura Wellesley, who's had the huge task of sorting all the logistics and making sure that everything runs smoothly, so thank you to Laura. And finally, thanks to the chairs that we've had over the last 2 days. and for the speakers, making sure that it's been a very interesting and stimulating meeting. And a final thank you to all of you for battling your way through London's public transport system. Yes, so that's it. Thank you very much. We have tea and coffee upstairs, so please do continue your discussions upstairs. And we look forward to seeing you in June.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Carnstone.